Dear viewers, many thanks for joining me. I am Addis Asafa, hosting and producing this program. In our today's edition, we are going to discuss about the Ethiopian economic reform that has been undertaken over the past 3 years or so, and I joined by an investor and long-serving economist, and he is chairing a global investment firm in Africa. Before directly going about the reform being undertaken in the economic segment, I would like to ask him his investment firm that is being undertaken in sub-Saharan Africa.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your program. I was recently on the Amharic version of your network. So, as you've indicated, I'm the global chairman of an American, US-based, Washington, D.C.-based investment firm. It's primarily focused on doing investments in sub-Saharan Africa, with a little bit of investments in other parts of the world. But the firm also does strategic advisory and in certain parts of the world where it's allowed to do investment banking work. But the firm's primary focus is Africa, including, of course, Ethiopia, which is one of the more dynamic and hopefully will be, I would say, in our view, a very exciting investment destination for the next several years. So in summary, that's what we do. And as I said, I'm very pleased to be on your program today.
Okay, good. As it is all known, the new administration headed by Dr. Abiy Ahmed, after he and his leadership took office, so many reforms had been carried out. We are going to discuss only the economic reform that had been undertaken and being undertaken as well. How do you see the economic reform from the perspective of economic analysis?
So in order to answer that, I think it's good to give you a background of the Ethiopian economy over the last, say, 20 years, so that we have a perspective of where it is today and where it's going to go in the next 10 years, okay? As you may know, 20 years ago, or a little over 20 years ago, the Ethiopian economy was a tiny little nothing, okay? I don't think it even ranked in the top 20 of African economies. So during that period, of course, a lot of effort was made to grow the economy, to reform it, and a lot of it was led by government expenditure. So huge investments in infrastructure, roads, airports, bridges, industrial parks, and nothing. So a huge investment. And as a result, Ethiopia did achieve double-digit GDP growth. The IMF, the World Bank, and others acknowledge that. However, and this comes to the question that you asked me about why reforms and what has it achieved. I think that's probably the main topic. So the growth being what it is, okay, acknowledged by everyone, when the new reforms were introduced about a little over 3 years ago, the idea was, wait a second, is it sustainable the way we're going? Should the government be the lead in everything? That was another question. Has the economy diversified? Okay, growth is there, but did it diversify? And most importantly, was the growth fair and balanced? Okay? Or was it concentrated in a few areas, in a few individuals, or a few institutions? Okay, so they did reassess where the country was. And based on some of the panel discussions, presentations that was given to us by the new economic team, what they've discovered is that, yes, we'll acknowledge the growth, but here are the issues. One, debt sustainability. To achieve that growth, Ethiopia had borrowed a lot of money, a lot of it from abroad. As we speak today, the foreign debt of Ethiopia is about $25 billion, okay? So they're saying the debt level is not sustainable. Not the amount in absolute terms, but the country's ability to service it is becoming a big burden, especially compared to export earnings or hard currency earnings, what is you need, okay? The second thing they said they've discovered, based on the work that they've done, is there was really no structural transformation of the economy, okay? There was no diversification. We were still exporting commodities. We didn't move up the value chain. So they said that's another issue. The third thing is it wasn't fair and balanced. Yes, wealth was created. I mean, Ethiopia became one of the top 4 or 5 largest GDPs in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, there's no question about it.
That is a very paradox. We've been hearing that Ethiopia is one of the fastest growing economy in different media internationally even. But look, still there is inflation, there is starvation, there is, the economy is under break when we hear some way or another. What is this paradox?
So, as you said, listen, it was, if you look at the IMF data, it was the fastest growing economy in Africa for about 10 years in a row. I mean, that's a fact. The fact that the GDP went from almost nothing to the top 3 or 4 in sub-Saharan Africa, in absolute terms, it's just a fact. I'm one of those people who've been going around the world presenting this data and attracting investors. Those are facts. What I think we're looking at or is being focused on now is that path sustainable? Is that path, the growth that we saw of $107 billion GDP, which is what it is today? Okay, it was less than that 3 years ago, before some of the economic reforms were introduced, but let's say around 90 billion at that time. The question was, is it sustainable? Is the economy diversifying sustainably in sufficient amount, okay, in a quantifiable way? Is the growth quality, does it have the quality? So sustainability was one of the key issues. Diversification is an issue. The fair and balancedness, okay, was also another issue. So we should acknowledge the growth. It was there, it's a fact. And that's what this new, for example, when you look at the homegrown economic reform, the first several pages of the presentation will show you improvements in healthcare, improvements of road, how much road was built, energy, investments in energy, the airports, and social infrastructure. It acknowledges all that. So I think we need to be very clear about it. But the question that was raised is the ones I told you about. The debt was very significant. Ethiopia took on a lot of debt, and it was it went from low debt risk to high debt risk in terms of sustainability, its ability. That by itself is going to reduce or mitigate, or in other words, it will prevent you from growing sustainably if you do not address the debt. If you do not address the issue of diversification, as I said, we still export raw coffee when we should be, I'm just using coffee as an example because it's something that all Ethiopians will understand, as opposed to high value added coffee. Today, our coffee is exported to Europe, to Switzerland, and Germany, where they process it, they brand it, they package it. A lot of the value, the earnings, reside somewhere else. So this is an indication of a lack of diversification of the economy or sophistication of the economy, because when you're still exporting commodity, that means there's a problem. So that's another issue. The fair and balanced part is also an issue. If you continue to grow, but the average Ethiopian doesn't feel it, then you have a problem. So these were at least the team that put together the homegrown economic reform. They said these were some key issues that they found, they discovered, and they therefore needed to change some course, okay? And what they've done is, first, immediately they need to address what's called macroeconomic instability, okay? As I said, debt is one of them. The foreign exchange issue had to be addressed, and inflation in particular. Inflation, for the last 15 years, even though Ethiopia was the fastest growing economy, inflation was double digits, sustainably. I think it was around 15% average for 10 years in a row. So that's an indication of a problem. I mean, I've spoken about this even in the past. Okay, we're growing, but why aren't we addressing, why is inflation still in double digits? I mean, so these were some of the, And the other thing is,
Let me stop you here. Spoken out about this quality economic growth, right? Even per the 10-year perspective strategic plan, Ethiopia has planned to be a beacon of African prosperity by 2030 by registering a very quality economic growth. What does it mean by a quality economic growth? Speaking from the economy knowledge perspective.
without getting too technical, let me try to give you sort of a macro picture of what that means, right? So one of the targets that have been set, also it was set under the GTP, but even under this 10-year perspective plan, is for Ethiopia to become a middle-income country by 2030. Now, so the strategy is, that is not just going to be, there's a very simple way of measuring what middle income means. You take the total GDP, divided by the number of people in the country, and you come up with a number. So the World Bank has a standard measure. Today, as we speak, it's about $1,200. But by 2030, Ethiopia's target as a middle income is around $2,200-$2,300. But what they have decided is, I think it was...
What is the measurement for, registering a middle income? What does it mean by?
So it means, it's purely simple. I mean, in numbers terms, it's very simple. But I'm going to explain to you the background behind it. In simple terms, you take, today Ethiopia's aggregate GDP is $107 billion. Okay. There's 110 million Ethiopians. So roughly it's about $1,000. So that's how it's per capita GDP is calculated. Middle income is per capita income is calculated based on that. And then there's a definition of when you enter a middle income, which is about $1,200. So if you're around 12, today we're not there, we're just below that. So if you reach 1,200 today, by World Bank's definition, you'll consider the lower middle income. There are three layers. So there's lower, the middle, and the upper middle. And then you go to upper income country. So this is just simple definition. But what's important is not so much the number, that's a reference point, but the definition of a middle income is what has changed now. So what, under the 10-year perspective plan put together by the National Planning Commission and of course the Ethiopian macro team, that middle incomeness will have characteristics of other middle income countries like Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, maybe even countries like China, okay? Which means healthcare, education, technology sophistication. Essentially, not just the number, but you start feeling it. You get quality healthcare that is comparable to...
It's not about a figure.
It's not exactly, that's exactly the point. Because now, you remember, I talked about fair and balanced. Yeah. Now, the public will feel it because the middle incomeness.
Yeah.
That's exactly the point. So the healthcare system in Ethiopia will reflect a middle income country's healthcare system.
When they achieve that, they feel it.
They feel it, exactly. The educational system, the same thing. The technology sophistication, the industrialness of the country, okay? The industrial base of the country.
Is going to be visible.
Is visible, and you can feel it, and you can say, I feel like I'm in a middle income country.
It's not going to be only statistics,
exactly.
Or figure or level.
So this is exactly the point, that is different from maybe the past. I mean, in the past, we also had targeted to become middle income country. Maybe it wasn't quite defined. The other key change that we see now is the private sector is going to be the lead, or at least it will have a very significantly enhanced role in the economy compared to the past. In the past, the growth that you saw, that we all acknowledge, was state-driven. Okay, you build sugar factories, you build roads, huge. In fact, at one point...
you mean the work's done to liberalize the economy?
Yes. So I'm trying to compare to because we're talking about reforms here, the changes that are coming.
Exactly.
So what the government has done now is we will let the private sector have a very significant role in the growth of the economy going forward. Yeah. Okay. Now, I don't want to use the word private sector led or government led, but let's call it an appropriate significant leadership role by the private sector as opposed to the last 20 years. Now, part of the reason in the past 20, 25 years the state led the growth is because there was no private sector. Yeah. But even when there was a nascent private sector, I'll be very frank with you, there was suspicion by the state of the private sector. Exactly. So the private sector was timid, it couldn't grow, it wasn't quite sure how to invest. Now they're being told, and there's a very good example of this now. Recently, if you saw the presentation in the parliament, there was a report the PM presented to the parliament saying this past year, loans given by banks in Ethiopia, 70% went to the private sector. If you look at the statistics in the past, it was the other way around. 30% to the private sector, 70% to the state. So there's a real measurement. It's early days, but starting to see that this notion or idea or strategy of building up the private sector is actually being quantified.
Let alone all the political ups and downs, but we've been witnessing an economic reform under this leadership, right? I mean, no doubt.
3 years is a
very short period of time, yeah.
But you're starting to see that. So
it's a wonderful startup anyway.
Right. I mean, as I said, 3 years is a very short period of time, but you're starting to see that. So
it's a wonderful startup anyway.
Well, listen, as someone who comes from the private sector, I would say yes, absolutely. I mean, this is a good thing that the private sector. However, the private sector still needs a lot of support. It's new, created maybe in the last 20 years. It's limited by what I call the 2 C's, the financial capital and the human capital. So we do need to acknowledge that because we can't just offload everything to the private sector and do it because I'm talking about the domestic private sector, okay? But at least we're now saying not only lip service, we're saying in substance, we're giving you 70% of loans from banks to the private sector, okay? And a lot of reforms. If you look at the transport sector now, it's almost completely liberalized, opened up to private sector. I recently participated about a month ago in a transport sector investment seminar organized by the minister herself. It was very successful. $74 billion of investment opportunities are now available to the private sector, which was not available in the past, which was all closed off. So the telecom sector liberalization. If you saw recently, the government announced they will open up the sector and the companies are now bidding to enter the market. So these are all the reforms that I'm giving you a macro picture because of the interest of time, but a lot of reforms are taking place now, piggybacking on the success of the previous, but making sure it's sustainable. The other thing the Ethiopian government is doing, and I've done a lot of interviews recently, I was on CNBC discussing this, one of the key challenges the team is faced when they took over 3 years ago, the economic team, was debt. So what they've done is they've started renegotiating with the IMF. It's called debt reprofiling, meaning to stretch out the debt payment periods. Ethiopia is now part of the G20 debt restructuring program, which means the wealthy 20 countries in the world will allow countries like Ethiopia to defer debt payments or ideally to cancel their debt or reduce some of the debt. So these, just some of the initiatives that the government is taking, because no matter how much you export, if you have to pay out all of it or majority of it for debt service, that means you have very limited ability to invest in your country. So a lot of reforms are taking place.
Okay, Mr. Zemedene, can you give me your expertise by putting comparison between the growth and transformation plan with that of the 10-year prospective strategic plan? The growth and transformation plan was headed by the ousted leadership, the previous leadership before Abiy came into power, or Abiy's administration came into power.
Right. So compare or contrast, I guess, is what you're asking me. In terms of how GTP was formulated versus how the 10-year program is quite dramatically different, the approach they took. Now, some of the goals are similar, double-digit GDP growth, middle income, but let me start with the approach. GTP was top-down. It was dictated at the top and it was filtered down to people say, go and implement it. There was very little feedback or collaboration by stakeholders. The 10-year plan that has now been implemented and approved by the parliament was actually very clear. I've participated in a few of the panel discussions that the Ministry of the Planning Commission organized. Stakeholders from private sector, other stakeholders, NGOs, civil societies have all been involved. So there is a feeling that we were part of the process. So that means people feel like ownership is there, okay, for this thing to be rolled out. That's one difference. Second, as I said earlier, GTP was a state-driven strategy. Now, I have to say, many countries like China have used that. Japan, after 1945, used the state to lead its early days of transformation because there was no private sector. So that is one difference. The key big change for me, one, as I mentioned earlier, is that the private sector now is going to have a very significant role in the economy in Ethiopia. That was not really factored in GTP. Part of it is, obviously, there was no private sector. Part of it is ideological, okay? The state has to run. I mean, I'll be honest with you. For example, I also used telecoms as a litmus test. And I had raised it many times. Why is Ethiopia the only country in the world that has a telecom monopoly of this size? I always said that. And in the past, no, it's considered a cash cow. I disagree with it, but that's an ideological position that the government had. Okay, you can agree or disagree, but that was, so those are different. Now, as I said, private sector led, but also I define it more like PPP, public-private partnership, is now a big part of the growth model. Okay, in almost, if you look at the energy sector, in the past, the government generated and distributed energy. Private sector was not allowed. A little bit was started to be allowed the last 5 years, but not much. Now, that sector is completely liberalized. The private sector can do, with the exception of like the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or some really huge things that maybe the private sector is not going to be in, most of the energy production in the future in Ethiopia is going to be done by the private sector. Again, it's a change from the past, emphasizing that private sector will have the role. So that's one key element. How it was developed, top-down versus now collaborative, the opening up of the economy to private sector, both domestic and international. I think these will be some. And then earlier I defined also for you that middle income is now going to be defined by the characteristics that you can quantify in such a way that the public also feels there is real growth, and we now feel like we're part of a middle income country. These were just some high level changes.
Another question. As I have said a while ago, Ethiopia has been registering the fastest economic growth. In the meantime, over the past 3 years, the new leadership under Abiy has achieved so many economic progress and achievements. In the meantime, people are kneeling down in the inflation heat. What does it mean by we're having economic growth, economic reform? Again, behind the curtain, there are people who are staggering and suffering with the inflation. Why this all inflation is loaded on the public, on the community's shoulder?
So I'll give you two answers, okay? But this is a very important question you're asking. Why does the government have, or the country has to focus on the issue of inflation? For the simple reason that inflation impacts the vast majority of Ethiopians who live on fixed income or low income. And recently, as I said, I saw data that was presented again in Parliament, which was striking, which was really amazing. 60% of an average Ethiopian's household monthly expenditure is on food. The other 20% is on rent. 80% by those two. And where is a lot of the inflation coming from? From those two. Food inflation and housing inflation is really affecting the average Ethiopian. Okay? So let me explain what that means. Both are, need to be addressed. That's one of the reasons, by the way, when people like me come on programs like you and we talk about double-digit GDP growth, for the average person, it means nothing. I'll be honest with you, because they don't feel it. I mean, people stop me on the street. Recently, I was in Mercato. Okay, usually when I'm in Ethiopia, I drive around just to see what is new and all. So I drove to, I went to Mercato. I was sitting in my car, observing. There's a lot of activity. So one of the guys is an older guy, maybe in his late 60s, early 70s. He knocks on my window. And he said, hey, you're the guy who's always on TV telling us our economy is growing. Listen, I'm sorry to tell you, I don't feel it. I'm telling you. He said, what is this double-digit? You know?
Yeah. That's why I say it's a paradox, because all the time we just hear that TVs and other print medias, televising or broadcasting, whatever, hearing all this. Ethiopia, one of the fastest growing economy in Africa. What does it mean by? So where is the economy? Like if we are having a very fast growing economy, it's a paradox. That's why the irony behind all this is like being starving and like fighting with our daily bread.
Right. So this was, I was trying to explain to him, like an economist or a professional, in a mechanical way. Then I realized, for him, it meant nothing. He needs to feel it himself, right? He said, my wife goes to Gulut and she can't buy anything with 100 birr. So what are you talking about growth? And I completely agree. This is where, as I said, the macroeconomic instability, imbalance, needed to be addressed for the average Ethiopian to feel there's growth, wealth is being created. So, going back to my earlier point. So if food inflation is one of the issues, you need to address the issue of supply and demand. Remember, I told you earlier, the economy, despite being the fastest growing economy in Africa for 10 years in a row, didn't really diversify, okay? Didn't deliver was not able to supply the demand. We have a population that is growing by 2.5 million net per year. 2.5 million, okay? Very young, very dynamic. That means there's a huge demand out there for basic supplies, foods, clothing, shelter, and all that kind of stuff. The lack of significant diversification and ability to produce to match that growth, because on the one hand, purchasing power did go up in nominal terms, okay? In absolute terms. But the supply of our industries, our economy, was not sufficient. That's one thing. Second, Ethiopia's retail wholesale distribution system is still extremely primitive. It's more like a cartel-like approach that we have for basic distribution. A few companies import something, are allowed to import just a few companies, for whatever reason, are allowed just a few, and the rest have to depend on those. I've always suggested, for the last several years, open it up to international investors. Joint venture with locals. They come with knowledge, know-how, and capital. Okay? Why restrict it to just Ethiopians? Okay? The result is what you see today. Our traders, our retail companies who provide the basics to Ethiopians expect 100%, 200%, 300% markups. Unheard of in the rest of the world. So you have the imbalance, but also the cartel-like structure that is creating these problems. Yes, we can talk about lack of forex and other things, but the basics need to be addressed. So one of the solutions is open it up.
Yeah. I really appreciate it. Okay, what has to be done to mechanize the agriculture sector? Recently, again, I need to acknowledge this new leadership, though I'm a journalist, it doesn't work out for me, but within a dry season, for the first time, we have seen a wheat production that is developed through irrigation, and we've seen also cluster farming, neighboring farmers developing together, and mechanizing their agriculture, the traditional way of plowing land by ox, that is being changed and showing a paradigm shift. And what has to be done in a very mechanized way to halt importing wheat and other food products from abroad? In your experience from Canada, America?
So I'm glad you mentioned wheat, because earlier I mentioned coffee, but there is no reason at all for Ethiopia to be a wheat importer. I know there's a strategy in the next 2 years, we're going to stop importing, right? In fact, maybe next X number of years, Ethiopia could be an exporter of wheat. It's part of the reason. Let me put it in a simple way so that your program audience can understand. Ethiopia has 74 million hectares of arable land. 74 million. You know how much is cultivated? 14 million out of the 74 million. That by itself should tell you. So it's not lack of land, it's not lack of water, it's just we haven't invested in the sector as much as we should. Something like 85% of Ethiopians depend on agriculture, right?
And that agriculture is too traditional, employing by ox over the past 1,000 years.
So this is exactly my point. So we need to modernize, we need to give agriculture the priority, because if we're going to talk about transformation of the Ethiopian economy, it will not happen if agriculture is not modernized. I'm starting to see some very encouraging things recently. Combiners, harvesters, tractors are starting to be used in large scale.
That has to be encouraged.
Absolutely. Because, by default, Ethiopia is rapidly urbanizing. It's one of the fastest urbanizing countries in the world today, because it's the least urbanized in the world today, but it's also at the same time one of the fastest urbanizing in the world. The young people, if you continue on the path that they were, this very primitive farming, they will leave the farm. You won't have anybody left. So transformation of the agriculture sector, both in productivity and moving up the value chain. We export raw sesame. Why? The value add is now, the dollar, the yuan, the pound is now retained offshore by those who process it and export it, right? I talked about coffee. All our stuff. So when we talk about modernization, it's from the crop production to the value addition. We cannot ignore agriculture. Listen, in the United States, where I spend most of my time, the United States is one of the world's largest exporters of agricultural products. Even though it's the world's largest, the more sophisticated economy, it still gives priority to the agricultural sector.
Yeah,
we need to do the same thing.
Of the economy.
Absolutely. And when the farmer gets wealthy, people like us who produce clothing, who produce other things, we have earnings, we have revenue, we have consumers. It's all integrated.
Well, the value chain goes starting from there.
Exactly. So remember earlier, to go back earlier to the point about the economic reform, okay? There are 5 pillars. One is agriculture, okay? ICT is the other one, mining, tourism, and other things. But agriculture is the anchor. So we need to modernize it. We need to understand how to create, for example, collectively. Today, each farmer has a small plot of land. So, like real estate developers do in big cities, including United States, come together, work them, put the plots together, help them mechanize.
We have seen a good startup with that of the cluster farming recently.
Exactly. I think that's what you mentioned. So there's a lot that needs to be done in the I promise you, Ethiopia today is the second largest producer of wheat in Africa, and yet we're wheat importers. I should tell you, sad, really sad actually. I know you call it sad, funny, but I call it sad.
Funny,
because
sad, yeah.
Exactly, we spend hundreds of millions every year on wheat imports, when we should be. I used this very simple example recently. I tweeted about it. Recently I had, guests in my house, and they went and bought juice from the grocery. Okay, this is a sad story again. So when they came back and I looked at the package, it's orange juice and pineapple juice. You won't believe it. It's made in Egypt. We import processed packaged juice from abroad when we as a country should be exporting. Egypt is a desert, right? I'm just using Egypt as an example. There's a lot of other countries from the Gulf. We import from other parts of the Gulf, from the desert, packaged juice at 5-6 times what we exported the raw citrus from. Again, this is earlier to tie to the economic reform. There wasn't much of a transformation of the economy. This is a very good example. That's why reforms and changes are needed. Why are we importing Jews from abroad when we should be? I mean, look at the streets of Addis or any big city in Ethiopia. The streets are full of fruits, right? Papaya, mango, banana, apple. I mean, it's fruits, full of it, and yet we probably export a little bit of that. I heard that we're actually even importing fruits from abroad. I think it should be illegal. Anyways, I don't want to get too technical because it's a TV program. It's not an economics presentation for college students, but these are simple things that should help us focus our mind and say, we can do it, we can change. This is why we think we can grow by 10.2% over the next 10 years under the new 10-year perspective plan. When we do these things, when we achieve the characteristics, this is exactly what it means, defining the characteristics of a middle-income country. We stop importing these kinds of things from abroad and actually be net exporters.
Thank you very much. Another question. So many projects and initiatives have been embarked and launched through this new leadership over the past 3 years. To mention some, the Sugar, the Ntoto Park, the Wanchi, which is under construction, the Koisha, all this have got their contribution in boosting up the economy sector. How do you see it from from your expertise knowledge?
So at the macro level, one of the 5 pillars of the economic transformation of Ethiopia is tourism, okay? Because it's an underdeveloped sector. It's actually, Ethiopia is naturally one of the most beautiful countries in the world. I've worked and lived in many countries over the last 25, 30 years. Naturally, there's no question Ethiopia. But we have historical tourism. The only thing we do not have is the beach. Okay, we don't have a coastline. But it's underdeveloped, even compared to our neighbors in Kenya or in East Africa. The amount of revenue Ethiopia brings in from tourism is relatively small compared to its potential. So we need to put that in context when we talk about all these new initiatives are designed to attract both domestic tourism as well as, most importantly, foreign tourists. I was one of the first people who visited the park, okay, in the palace that was inaugurated, 18 months ago? I was very impressed. Our history is right there to be seen, right? And the new ones you just mentioned. By the way, the first time I was sitting in New York or Washington when I saw the Wanchi Lake. I swear I thought maybe I was looking at Lake Geneva or some lake or somewhere in the rest of the world. And I really, this is how unaware we are of how much asset we have, both for ourselves as Ethiopians, but also to attract tourism. So these initiatives and many others to come, and the huge focus that is being given to the tourism sector. Now, we have to acknowledge 2020 was a horrible year for tourism, okay? I mean, around the world. Airlines around the world went bankrupt, because of COVID, right? I mean, so we should exclude 2020, not use it as any reference point. But 2019 and then going forward, post-COVID, when people start traveling, then I think when we have these destinations ready, we'll be able to attract tourism. So it's a very easy way of generating hard currency. Secondly, from experience, I can tell you, if you attract people as tourists, they get attached to the country when they go back. And I know people who've made investment decisions later on based on the feeling they had after they visited a country as a tourist. You have a reference. Well, I was in Ethiopia. I know a few people who came to Ethiopia as tourists, very important people, decision makers, running big multinational companies who work with us, and they went back saying, this is a country I didn't know much about before I came, but I like it. So when you pitch them an investment idea, he has that, he or she, but usually it's a he has that country, I saw it. I felt it for myself. It's underdeveloped, but I see the potential. So that's also another way of creating goodwill for investors to come and put money in this country.
Currently, you're working for a giant global investment firm that is owned and based in America, right? And mostly work under, sub-Saharan Africa. And let's talk about Ethiopia. Do you think Ethiopia is favorable and conducive for investment to attract foreign investors? And if so, in what aspect?
Right. So the way I define attractiveness, specifically when it comes to Ethiopia, is I always say this to investors. The fundamentals, the economic fundamentals, the long fundamentals of Ethiopia are still very strong. Okay? Large population, steadily increasing purchasing power by 112 million, soon to be 130 million Ethiopians, rapid urbanization. The demographics are extremely attractive, very young. 70% of Ethiopians are under 30, right? A lot of the sectors that you would find saturated in many other parts of the world, even in Africa, still untapped manufacturing. I'll give you an example. I'm the chairman of a big global clothing manufacturer. So it's an Italian company. I'm the chairman for the Ethiopian division, which is essentially the Africa business. And currently, the company made the decision to invest in Ethiopia, which is the first factory for them in Africa, because they saw the long-term potential of Ethiopia. So today, we are producing clothing 100% for exports from Ethiopia to the rest of the world. Quality, first-class quality, you can find in shops in London, Paris, or in Washington, D.C., okay? So in the clothing sector, for example, Ethiopia can compete with Bangladesh or Vietnam or other places that used to do, and even China, by the way. Okay, Chinese are no longer interested in making clothing. They're becoming very expensive. So the answer to your question is, yes, I think the long-term fundamentals of Ethiopia are very strong. And then in certain industries, extremely competitive. Large pool of labor is available. 45 million young Ethiopians today are in the labor pool. Now, you have to invest in them, train them, and share the wealth and the vision with them, but they're there. There are countries whose entire population is 5 million or 7 million. We're talking about just the labor pool is 45 million. So for certain industries, I'm not going to tell you today we'll be manufacturing electric cars in Ethiopia. We're not there yet, or certain things. But we're talking about labor-intensive manufacturing, industries that can benefit from vast opportunities in the agriculture, agro-processing sector. The talent pool, the young talent pool now could be deployed in the technology sector, no question about it. The tourism sector I talked about, and natural resources, from gold to potash to platinum, tantalum, untapped. So when we talk about which parts are Ethiopia attractive for, at the macro level, yes, as a country, but also in certain industries, there's no question Ethiopia could be both competitive, has both competitive and comparative advantages compared to most other countries in Africa.
Okay, shall we discuss about import and export balance of Ethiopia?
Sure. Right, so this is a recurrent discussion that comes up all the time. By the way, this is also one of the issues that the homegrown economic reform is focused on trying to address. When we talk about Forex challenge for Ethiopia, you have to understand there's a big imbalance between Ethiopia's hard currency earnings and its hard currency expenditures. Okay, a lot of it, of course, depends on how much we export, but it also depends on other things like remittances from the Ethiopian diaspora, which are major earners. Tourism until 2020, until COVID hit, was also a major source of hard currency. But even under normal circumstances, we always perennially have a deficit, an imbalance between the export and import. So the solution is, of course, is increase your exports, reduce imports by import substitution, increasing local production. This all goes back to the earlier point we're talking about. Why do we need economic reform? That means we need to produce more locally. not only for the domestic market, but ideally for the export market. So until we address that, we'll continue to have an imbalance between export and import. I mean, this is a simple mathematics, you know.
Okay. Dear viewers, this brings you the end of our edition for today. Hope you had a wonderful insight about Ethiopian economy. Have a wonderful time. Bye-bye.